if you're interested in the She, the Fairies, the Fae, the Púca, and other otherworldly beings in Irish folklore, stay tuned because you're just about to find out. Hello everyone, I'm Angela and welcome back to my channel. Today I have a very special guest here on the channel. It's Dr. Jenny Butler, a dear friend of mine and a brilliant scholar. She's lecturer at the University College Cork and she specializes in Irish folklore. So in this interview, we will be talking about the She, the Fairies, the Fae, and the Puca, of course, and otherworldly beings in Irish folklore. And please do check out the timestamps because I will leave everything in the info box so that you can just jump onto what you're most interested in. So please help me in welcoming the lovely and extremely knowledgeable Jenny Butler. Hello, Jenny. How are you today?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm okay, thanks. I'm really happy to have you here on my symposium once again.
Glad to be here again.
Besides, the fact that I really like you as a person, I also adore your work. And so it's always a pleasure to have you here and have my viewers being exposed to your fantastic work and fantastic academic research.
Thank you. And likewise, Angela.
So today we are going to talk about otherworldly beings in Irish folklore. So the first question or the first topic I'd like to address is what are the She? Where does the term come from? And can you give us an overview of the She as figures in Irish folklore?
Yeah. So the She, or this term comes from the Old Irish language. So there's Old Irish, which is now a dead language. So people like Celtic studies scholars study it, but it developed into modern Irish. So this is a Celtic language, and this is where we get the word She. So in modern, there's all different spellings of the word, but in modern Irish we pronounce it She. And it's thought that it might have been pronounced sheath, like a sword sheath in Old Irish. So nobody really knows. So this is a word for the otherworldly beings of the spiritual realm that's connected with the landscape. And this is similar in other Celtic mythologies. And when Ireland was colonized, the people were forced to speak English, and She was translated as fairy. But the term She and fairy, they're not the same. And actually, that native term She is not translatable directly. So when people say fairy, as Irish people do, so we use the words synonymously, people have many other associations with that word. It came into English via French, fairy, and it has many poetic usages and much more romanticized words. So the She, we have different terms, different phrases in Ireland. An slua She means the fairy host. So the collective group of otherworld people who move, they're kind of conceptualized or understood as moving across the landscape together, as a collective, and living in this otherworld community, which is described as almost like a mirror image of the human realm. So that I'm going to use She and fairies, synonymously, that the fairy people have their own habitations, their own cattle and horses and so on. And there's many stories of them having a royal family, like fairy kings and queens. And Ireland in ancient times would have had a royal family as well. So there's many colloquial or local ways of talking about fairies because of the belief that it's unlucky to directly speak of them, that they don't like human beings being able to talk about them or see them. And some of the phrases we have are both terms of respect and maybe fear as well, of drawing their attention. So things like calling them, euphemistically the other crowd, or the wee folk, the little people, or just them. Coded ways of talking about them. And I mentioned the wee folk, little folk, there were many different descriptions of what fairy people look like. And some are that they're small, but maybe, smaller than human beings rather than teensy tiny. So I think the diminutive, cutesy fairy image comes from things like Tinkerbell in Peter Pan, and especially the Disneyfication of those stories. And so there's the general idea is that the fairy world is kind of intersecting with the human world, the ordinary reality that human beings experience, and that for most people, fairies and their world are invisible. But there's what's known as the second sight, an ability like clairvoyance to be able to see into the other world. So clairvoyance in French is literally clear seeing, and the second sight is a similar concept, that somebody has a gift to be able to perceive, whether that's hearing or seeing the fairy folk. And I mentioned the landscape. So the other world, the Celtic otherworld, as it's described, is coterminous with the earth. So it's the same landscape as human beings perceive and go about their activities in. And there is a mythological account of different peoples who they're described as mythical invaders, but different people who came to Ireland and battled with each other for control of the country. And two of those mythical peoples, they're the Milesians, or the sons of Mil, and the Tuatha De Danann. So the Tuatha De Danann means, Tuatha is a tribe or people, and Dana or Anu is a goddess. So it's generally agreed that this is a feminine form of the name. So Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Anu, they lose their battle against the Milesians at Magtirid or Moitura, and the Tuatha De Danann go into the landscape, into the mounds on the landscape. So we have a tradition known as the Hollow Hills. So there are both naturally occurring hills known as fairy hills, but we also have many different structures, archaeological remains, including mounds like at the Hill of Tara in County Meath and Newgrange in the Boyne Valley. So there's also many structures called ring forts that are colloquially known as fairy forts. And all of these mounds, so these are also circular monuments. Some of them, the ring forts, remain as mounds. Some have flattened out over time. So these are in fields all over Ireland, and they're actually the most well-preserved archaeological monument because of the beliefs about them. So before they had, protection from the state, people did, they left them alone because it's unlucky to interfere with so-called fairy places. So another place, another thing associated with fairies is the hawthorn tree. So this in Ireland is known as a fairy tree. And so there are many legends and first-hand accounts as well of something bad happening if somebody breaks the branches of a hawthorn tree or cuts one down. So it's quite ambiguous. You know, the landscape is the point of kind of numinous contact between this other world and the human realm, but it's not so clear cut as fairies being under the ground. So, you know, from the mythological story, you have the idea that the descendants of the Tuatha De Danann are the fairies living below the ground or inside the earth, and the descendants of the Milesians are the human beings who live above the ground. So you have that kind of idea of neighbours sharing the same physical landscape, but at the same time it's quite ambiguous. It's not so clear cut, as I said, about them being under the ground, because that's not always how things are experienced by people, or how how legends describe how someone might end up in the other world with the fairies.
That's really interesting. And I was wondering, is there a difference then between the Fae and the Fairies? Or are the two the same thing?
Well, the word, lots of different words are used for fairy beings or for different otherworldly beings, and they become mixed together from different cultural contacts. But I think a lot of it has to do with the English language and things being translated into English. So the word fae goes back to the Greek fates, you know, the goddesses who have control over human destiny, and the word fae then was used in poetry and in the literary tradition for something kind of whimsical or something more to do with enchantment. And then you also have Shakespeare's, you know, the whole imagery around Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. So that kind of more kind of romantic enchantment, very kind of I never know what word to use, but kind of very light-hearted or very whimsical association comes in with that word fae. It took on that meaning in English anyway. So it's different from the traditions about the she, because the native understandings, it's while she are associated with enchantment and being magical, it's sometimes quite sinister. They're, as I mentioned, they're otherworldly people. So they're people, human beings can be good or bad. They can behave very nicely. They can appear very beautiful, but then they can turn on you. They can do bad things. So it's the same with the fairies, with the she, and there are connections between the she and the dead. So this has been suggested by different folklorists, Catherine Briggs, for example, and there are hints in legends about the other world of the fairies possibly being the world of the dead, or that the human dead go there. So it's never explicitly described, but there are associations with death that don't fit. They don't mesh very well with those other ideas of more whimsical kind of enchantment.
Yeah, I was actually wondering, that's really fascinating. So what kind of relation they have found between the fairies and the world of the death?
Well, in the mythological material, that was the early Irish literature, or the mythology, was written down by Christian scribes in medieval times. So there's a big gap in time there. You know, if you can imagine, the pagan world has already ended by the time something is written down about them in the Irish context. So in some of these medieval manuscript accounts, there are references to the other world. Like there's different names for the other world. Tír na nÓg is one of them. So Tír means country, and Og in Irish means young. So it's translated as land of eternal youth or land of the young. And it's described as a bright paradise. So it's not clear whether those descriptions were influenced by the Christian cosmology of heaven, or whether this was the understanding in the pagan tradition. But it seems like there's connections between the Sidhe and the dead. If the other world is also, excuse me, the afterlife. But then in much later stories, so our folklore collections, then there's another big jump from medieval times to 19th, early 20th century would be the main time frame for the folklore collections that we have in Ireland. So there are legends where you have the motif for the happening of somebody falling asleep on a ring fort, a fairy fort, and then waking up in the other world with the fairies. So you have you have dreams being mentioned as well. So the person who wakes up in the other world, they see something like a beautiful, banquet hall with food laid out that smells beautiful and looks beautiful, and they're warned often by a dead relative, like let's say an aunt, not to eat the fairy food because it's not food as we understand it. So that would also connect the dead, with this world of the fairies. Like why is there a dead relative in this world? And the reason for not eating the food is, it's believed that if you eat fairy food, you become incorporated into the world of the fairies and maybe can't leave. So this also hints at it being the world of the dead, because if it's so wonderful, described as people singing and dancing and partying and having nice food, and being happy, and described as the land of eternal youth where people don't get sick and they don't age, why would somebody not want to stay there? So there's many inconsistencies and contradictions. And also to mention the festival of Samhain, which becomes Halloween. So on October 31st through November 1st, there's traditions in Ireland about remembering the dead, and the idea that the dead return to where they once lived. So people would leave the doors unlocked of their house, and maybe in some parts of Ireland they would put out what's known as a dumb supper, or set a place for the returning dead relative, or usually relative. So it's mentioned in the early Irish literature, in this medieval material, that the Sidhe, so the Sidhe open up at Samhain. So this word Sidhe, which I forgot to explain, has different meanings. So it can mean the fairy beings themselves, like the Anslua Sidhe, the fairy host, as it's called, the fairies themselves, and then it can mean the mounds on the landscape. They're also called Sidhe. And then the word also has a meaning of peace. So the peaceful quality of life that's believed to exist in the other world. And we still have this meaning in the Irish language. So, for example, our police force are called An Garda Síochána, which means literally the guardians of the peace. So she, or Síochána, as being peaceful. So the mounds on the landscape, the Sidhe opening up at Samhain, You have the the whole belief around the spirits intermingling with human beings during this time of year. And so there's also a connection there with the later traditions that we've recorded of the returning dead. So some have suggested that the Sidhe are the dead, or that the other world incorporates the human dead. And there's a distinction in Ireland between what's known as a good death and a bad death. So a good death, it's not that it's good someone has died, it's that they've lived a long life and they're very old, and everybody dies, so they're expected to die. And a bad death would be a tragic death, like a woman dying in childbirth, somebody dying, a young person dying in an accident, a child dying. So these things are associated with going to the fairy realm. So whereas people dying when they're very old, they get the last rites, the Roman Catholic ritual of the last rites, and they're understood as going to heaven. So by the time the folklore collections were made, Ireland had already been Christianized, from the very first accounts in medieval times. And then by the time the legends that we have were recorded, you had people, we don't know how the people who told the stories would reconcile somebody being in the fairies, that's an expression, in the fairies, somebody being in the other world with the fairies, while others are believed to be in heaven. So part of the problem with that is that there was a lot of focus on the legends. So we had the literary revival, or the Anglo-Irish literary revival, where people like Yeats, William Butler Yeats, Lady Augusta Gregory, and their contemporaries collected stories and they published them, but they didn't give a huge amount of contextual information. And then later you had the Irish Folklore Commission from 1935 until 1970. So again, there was a lot of emphasis on the stories, the texts of the stories and the storytelling tradition, but not so much in the way of interviews about people's beliefs. So to give a wider context or bigger picture to those stories. And just to mention, the Irish Folklore Commission did send out surveys to, the households in the country, and asked about things like festivals, celebrations, and many other beliefs and customs and so on. So we also have material from that, but we don't have very many interviews, as anthropologists and folklorists would do today, to give that kind of context of belief. So we don't really know how people would have reconciled those ideas, or whether they believed in the stories they were telling, or whether they claimed to believe these things.
I hope it's not too off topic, but what you just said made me completely rethink Peter Pan. So now I think that he wouldn't age, because actually he was dead and he was actually in the world of death. Like in that kind of afterlife where you won't age anymore, and that's why he was surrounded by fairies. I just had this kind of complete different vision of Peter Pan. I'm not sure whether it's what they actually had in mind, but connecting all the things that you said in terms of the folklore surrounding the fairies.
There's no one explanation that would account for all of this fairy lore, because for example, you have changelings, the changeling stories of a fairy being, usually an old fairy man, being put in place of a human person, So the stories we most often associate with that are about babies being taken away by the fairies and replaced by a changeling. And people have, there have been quite reductionist academic studies of changeling narratives from a medical or psychological perspective to try to match up the descriptions of the changeling with things like medical conditions and illnesses and psychological things like, being depressed or things like autism as well, to try to explain, away this material. And if I'm using this example because if we say that if the she are the dead, if this is the world of the dead, then that doesn't fit with changelings. Why would the dead, why would they try to take young human beings? It doesn't. There isn't a cohesive way of understanding because the material has been collected in such a piecemeal way in different centuries and through different, from different perspectives and different lenses for analysing culture, and even the idea of folklore itself is problematic when we're trying to understand this as a bigger picture.
Do you think that when they thought of fairies, they were referring to different beings, or is it just that different places and different times interpreted fairies differently?
I think there's both things. I think, ideas and beliefs change through time. Even within religious traditions, beliefs change. So that's occurring all through time. But then you also have the difficulty with the linguistic side of it and the translation into different time periods, as well as, you have cultural and linguistic translation. And one of the things in the Irish context is that everything seems to be called a fairy. The she are not differentiated in very precise ways. So you have the different mythical peoples, like I mentioned, the Tuatha De Danann and so on. But when you compare to something like the Greek context, where you have the mythological tradition is much more defined in terms of the different beings. You have sprites in the water, nymphs and dryads in the trees, and then you have the deities. But in the Irish, you have there's the whole issue of the different religious cosmologies and cultural cosmologies, because Christians were the first ones to write down the material. And then in the stories collected in different time periods, many things are described as fairies, that maybe in other parts of the world would have unique names or categorizations.
Yeah, that happens sometimes with certain terms. Maybe they become so attached to the folklore of that specific place that they become very fluid in nature, in what they represent and what the term denotes.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask you about the Púca, which I know that in Irish is spelled like my surname. So what are the Púca? Is there a plural like Púcas, or is it just Púca?
Well, a Púca in Irish is the word for a ghost. So people can mean ghost if they're saying Púca. But there's different legends, but it seems the more prevalent idea is that there is the Púca, like it's a particular being, like the Banshee, being an otherworldly death messenger. But there's also beliefs that there are many different Banshees, and similarly many different Púcas. So it's been suggested that this is a shape-shifting kind of trickster being, and it's been suggested that there might be a connection with the Scandinavian mythology and folklore, that generally speaking, the Norse came to and settled in Ireland, and the Danes in England and other parts of Britain, and they had Púki, Puki, which is thought to have some connection with the Irish Púca, but it's a variously described, sometimes appearing as a horse with red eyes, the mane or the bristles, like the mane being more like bristles going the wrong way or something askew, and of taking people on nightmare rides, which is something we also have in the Scandinavian Mara, nightmare traditions. And in Ireland, there's stories that the Púca comes and either urinates or spits on the fruit before Samhain, or on the evening of Samhain, and after that time, that's why you shouldn't eat the fruit, like blackberries and so on, from the bushes.
Not a nice being to be associated with then. And what about the Banshees? Can you tell me something more about the Banshees and the relation? I mean, how they are seen as beings in the Irish folklore?
So the folklorist Patricia Lysett describes the Banshee as the supernatural death messenger. So this is a otherworldly woman who she cries and wails to notify about death. So she's telling the living that somebody among them is going to die. She doesn't cause death, and it's believed to be very, very unlucky to interfere with the Banshee, like to try to stop her from approaching or from crying. And there's different names for the Banshee. So I mentioned the way everything seems to be called a fairy. She's sometimes described as a fairy or fairy woman, because the name Ban in Irish is woman, and then she being fairy. So it's translated sometimes as fairy woman. And the Banshee is a as I mentioned, she cries and wails, or appears, sitting on somebody's windowsill. So the person who is dying doesn't normally see or hear the Banshee. It's usually somebody else, like somebody in the family or some neighbor who hears the Banshee or sees her. So her cry is described as something like either an animal at first, like a fox or an owl, and then it changes so that people who've heard it have described it as being, that they just know this is something unearthly. It's very loud, and sometimes they're the only one to hear it. If there's a group of people, maybe only one person hears this. So the Banshee is associated with having a comb, that's some kind of magical comb, sometimes described as being made of human bone or of precious metals that she combs her hair with. So you have a parallel there with things like the mermaid and the siren, who well, the siren is a bit different because she does cause death by singing and luring the sailors so that their ships get wrecked. But combing the hair comes into different legends. So if there's the advice, in Ireland, that if you are walking along a country road or anywhere and you see a comb, that you shouldn't touch it, because it could be the Banshee's comb and it could cause burns or cause somebody to die, because the person would be touching the other world. So again, you have the association with the death. But I mentioned that there's different beliefs about the Banshee. So some think there's one Banshee, and others think there are many different Banshees that follow different families. So there's an expression that the Banshee follows families with O or Mac in their name. And we have Gaelic names, so going back to the clan system of Ireland, names like O means of, so O'Brien, of the Bryan family. Mac means son of, so MacCarthy. So the equivalent for women would be Nick Carthick. But because to do with colonization and the language and so on, the names became formalized as McCarthy. So whether it's a man or a woman, but saying the Banshee follows people with O or Mac in their name is a way of saying that she follows the Gaelic clan structure, or those lineages, rather than people with Anglo-Norman names. So Irish names like mine, Butler, are not Gaelic. So she's said to follow O or Mac, and this might connect her to the sovereignty goddess tradition. So in the early Irish literature, we have stories and poems about a sovereignty goddess who represents the land of Ireland and is associated with giving a cup of sovereignty, a drink, to the new king or the rightful king. And there are, in this sovereignty goddess tradition, there are legends that a very frightening so-called hag, ugly woman, would appear, and when the person who's going to be king kisses her, she transforms into a beautiful young woman. So there are also different descriptions of the Banshee, some being that she's a young, beautiful woman combing her hair. Others that the more familiar one is that she's an old woman with long grey or white hair, and very frightening in appearance. So this might have something to do with that sovereignty goddess tradition, but again, nobody knows. So we're kind of tracing back and trying to tie up or connect strands that are separated by hundreds or possibly thousands of years and very different cultural, expressions and understandings. So another name for the Banshee is Baib, which is also a name of a war goddess who can transform into a crow. So we have the Morrigan, Nemen, and Baib.
What is the name again?
Baib. It's spelled BADHBH. There's different spellings, but it's pronounced Baib. And another name for the Banshee is Ban, so woman, and Quincha, which is, so the Ban, Queena in Irish is crying. And there's a human woman, this figure of Irish history that would lament for the dead, called the Ban Quincha. So that's been analysed by folklorists like Garrod O'Cruley, who've looked at the otherworldly Banshee as being the woman who cries death into the community, and then the human Ban Quincha would cry death out of the community. So it's thought that the the role of lamenting the dead, which was a female role, that this was to, in the pagan world, this was to cry the soul or the spirit over into the afterlife. So it was an extremely important cultural tradition that eventually died out for different reasons, including the Catholic Church trying to stamp it out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I was wondering, what role do these otherworldly beings and creatures play in the practice of magic in Irish folklore?
Well, the fairies are understood as being magical beings, and that they have powers to shapeshift, for example, and to cause harm, to cause confusion in human beings. So there's many stories and experiences of being turned around, it's called, of being confused in a very familiar landscape. So that's a magical quality associated with fairies, the either changing the landscape or changing the human's perception. And also there's a lot of the magical practices in terms of charms, to charms for protection would often be to ward off fairies or keep them away, particularly on the festival of Bealtaine or May Day, which is the traditional start of the butter making. So when people were relying, subsistence farmers, people relying on the food they were making themselves or selling it as their livelihood, butter was extremely important. So many of the magical abilities of fairies are, it's the same concern about fairies and the practice of witchcraft. So the same kinds of things would be used to protect the butter and the household or the farm from fairies' influence and from witchcraft. So it's more magical protections, but there's also the Ban Fasa, or the wise woman, and the fairy doctor, or the cunning folk, who would, their magical abilities are associated with communicating with the fairies. So there's different associations with magic.
Mm. Also, now I'd like to ask you a few questions from my patrons, from the members of my inner symposium, to whom I've asked whether they had questions for you. So the first one comes from Andrew. He's a big fan of yours. And
thanks, Andrew.
And Andrew asks, actually, there are two questions from him. I'm going to start with the first one. So he says that you gave a talk at the Trans States Conference this year on UFO religions. Given that and your knowledge of the Sidhe and other non-ordinary beings, would you consider alien encounters to be related to human interaction with fairy folk throughout history?
Well, there are many parallels that we can identify between fairy encounters and alien encounters. For example, I mentioned a while ago about the being turned around, being confused in a familiar landscape, often someone's own field, or this is something also recorded by what are known as the contactee movement, people who've they believe they have been abducted by aliens, or they've encountered alien beings. They often describe being confused in their own house, or in their own locality. So confusion is something associated with both fairies and aliens. Also, unusual lights. So we have the folklore of, will-o'-the-wisp, lights, little lights, or orbs that move. And this is also something that comes up quite a lot in the descriptions of alien encounters, sometimes associated with different crafts, but not always, like that the alien beings are somehow shining or bright themselves. So this is also described in many legends. The Tuatha De Danann in the mythological accounts that become associated with the fairies in later tradition, these are described as the shining ones, that they have some kind of radiance. So that's another parallel. And also missing time. So, there are many stories about people who go to the fairy world. So we have the Otherworld, where Oisín, so in the mythology, we have a hero, Oisín, who goes to Tir na Nog, and he thinks he's been there for a year, depending on the version, but he's been away for hundreds of years. And he comes back to Ireland, and he's told by Niamh, this otherworldly woman, not to get off the horse that she gives him. And he remembers this, and he's a very strong person. So he sees a group of men trying to move a boulder. So he tries to help them without getting off the horse, and he gets a stick, and he's trying to move the boulder with one hand, but he falls. And in different versions of the story, he turns to dust because he's hundreds of years old, or he asks for the last rites, or he hears the church bell. So you can see the Christian influences there, but losing time is something that comes into both the mythological accounts and the later experiences that we have recorded about fairies. So this is also a common feature of the alien encounters. So I think there are, because Andrew asked what I think, just to mention as well quickly that there's the Tuatha De Danann, there's two different versions, two different translations of the medieval texts. That one says the Tuatha De Danann came on the sea in their ships, and that they burnt their ships and it caused a smoke. The Tuatha De Danann are associated with a magical mist. There's another account, another translation, that the Tuatha De Danann came in cloud ships and landed on a mountain. So that they came from the sky. So it's interesting, that's a completely different meaning if they came from the sky. So we do have those kinds of associations or those parallels. But I think, personally, there are different kinds of beings that people are describing, different. I think there's a reinterpretation of older material that doesn't always have to do with looking outward. I think there are many associations with this world, this planet, if you want to say that, in different mythologies, older religions around the world, to do with an other world that is accessible through the land and through flora and fauna, rather than it being something cosmic. But I think there are also many interesting parallels, and part of the difficulty is the way all of this has been recorded historically. So we're all trying to understand it and find explanations for things. So I think it's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And also he's got another question for you. He says, Briggs defines 3 basic types of fairies: trooping, solitary, and domestic. Are these related? Do they intermingle? For example, would a domestic fairy return to a mound if it left the house having been slighted?
I think, Catherine Briggs gave some different categorizations. William Butler Yeats also talked about solitary fairies and trooping fairies. So that, you know, both Briggs and Yeats have been very influential on how people how they think about these kinds of beings. So there seems to be a difference between An Slua She, the fairy host, who are connected with the landscape, with those fairy places like trees and caves and mounds, and other beings like the leprechaun, who's associated with the house. And, you know, there are stories that it's lucky to catch a leprechaun because he grants wishes, and it's not so lucky to catch a member of the She. This would be something very dangerous in, you know, in the Irish tradition. And so it seems to be they're different kinds of beings. And there's many, you know, in other cultural traditions, in the Germanic and Slavic, there's beings that are associated with the house, like cobbles and things that live in the hearth, or you know, usually male otherworldly beings that are somehow tricksters, or they make things or they fix things. Like there's also the chloricon in Irish folklore, who makes shoes. So, you know, that seems something quite different from these otherworld people who have their own community that somehow kind of intersects with the human world. So
Okay, thanks for answering that. Then I have a question from Thomas. He asks about the figure of the Púca, which we have actually already covered. But then he also mentions whether the Púca is good or mischievous, and whether the media representation of the Púca is actually accurate, or is it a bit, you know, exaggerated?
So the good or bad thing, you know, there's been many. There's books like Brian Froud's Good Fairies, Bad Fairies. So people might think of them as being one or the other, but it seems from the Irish tradition anyway that fairies as otherworld people can be good or bad in a moral sense. They can behave as humans would. They make a choice rather than being inherently bad. And I think there's an influence from the Christianization of all of these things, where people tend to think of, you know, angels or demons. They're either one or the other, and demons being, you know, hell being below, and the darkness. This influences people's understanding of the fairy world being this chthonic realm. So in terms of the media representation, like I didn't really answer the question. So the Púca is portrayed as being like a trickster, being mischievous. I don't know if evil or bad would be right. You know, you could interpret it that the urinating or spitting on the fruit is for people's own protection, that they shouldn't eat them because they'll start to go moldy anyway after a certain point. So, you know, this has also been understood as a kind of way of protecting people from eating fruit when they shouldn't. But the only film portrayal I've seen of the Púca is in Darby O'Gill and the Little People, which I thought was true to the legends that we have documented. But in terms of fairy lore generally, there are some films that I like. There's one called The Hole in the Ground about a changeling. and there's another one called Daisy Chain, which is also about a changeling. So I thought those were well done.
And we have one last question from one of my patrons. This is from Dave. Dave says, first, Dr. Butler, really enjoy your work. So you've got lots of fans
Thanks,
in
Dave.
my nurse symposium. So the question is, some fairy myths change post-Christianity in terms of their origin and cosmology. Is there evidence that these stories are pre-Celtic and were absorbed and adapted in a similar cultural way, or are they seen as a Celtic invention?
Okay, so this is quite difficult to answer because we don't have really any information about the pre-Celtic way of life or religion. So we can say that the Celtic peoples who came to Ireland absorbed something of the pre-Celtic, and so the Celts, there's many debates about calling Irish culture Celtic. So the Celts first arrived in Ireland around 500 before the Common Era, and the word Keltoi from the Greek, is the people wouldn't have called themselves Celts, so we don't even know what their own name for themselves was. And Celts is a word we use for many different peoples who were moving into different parts of Europe around that time. So while we can make comparisons between the other world as it's described and portrayed in Irish tradition, we can compare that to other Celtic regions like Wales, and there's many similarities between Scottish and Irish Gaelic tradition that's much later. We know that there's some pan-Celtic deities like Bridget. So in Ireland you have the Christianized goddess. So there was Breed or Bridget, who became Saint Bridget. We know there was a goddess who's thought to be the same goddess, Brigindo in Gaul, which is modern day France, and the Brigantia, so the Brigantes tribe in Yorkshire. So we know there are those Celtic connections, but there's also things in that the medieval descriptions by those Christian scribes that are pre-Celtic. So some of the sites like Newgrange, you have the Boyne Valley and the goddess Boann. So Bo being cow, so this is a cow goddess associated with this site, Newgrange. Newgrange is pre-Celtic, so it's thought to be older than the pyramids at Giza, the Hill of Tara. The megalithic monuments are, likely to be some of them would be pre-Celtic. So nobody knows who built those structures. But they became associated with the Celts through many different romantic movements, so-called Celtic revivals. So it's very complex, and it's generally accepted in academia to call the mythological material, this what survives or has been passed on about the old religion, the pre-Christian. This is described as Celtic mythology, but it's far more complex than that. There are older influences and strands there that we aren't able to untie because we don't know anything really about the pre-Celtic.
When it comes to history, it's really difficult to kind of pinpoint even the moments, and it's a very difficult thing to answer, and I think it would have more to do with history rather than folklore, perhaps.
Well, there's the Celtic studies as an academic discipline looks at it's a kind of definition of Celtic rests on the language, the language families that are Celtic, like Irish and Welsh and Breton and so on, and the regions where those people settled and spoke their language in the distant past or in the modern day, where there's a Celtic language spoken. So it's it's time limited. The discipline only looks at a certain period of time. So it's you're kind of going into archaeology to explore anything before that, but nobody knows who built those sites or what exactly they were for. So there's different, celestial significances, different alignments to solstices or equinoxes. Like I mentioned, Newgrange, there's an inner chamber where the rays of the rising sun on the winter solstice lights up the chamber. So there are many theories about what that means, and cremations have been found in some of the sites, but nobody knows for sure. Only that they were somehow significant for the Celtic peoples, and they come into the myths and the legends all down through time.
Thank you so much, Jenny. This was really fascinating.
Thank you for having me on your channel again.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. Thank you so much again, Jenny, for being here on the channel again. It was absolutely fascinating. I really look forward to hearing all of your comments in the comment section. I really want to know what you think about everything we have discussed. And you will also find Jenny's contact details and publications and related publications in the info box. So do check everything out. And if you did like this interview, smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell so that you will never miss a new video from me. And as always, stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now.